I thought it'd be worth having a quick talk about the future of the right and what it can learn from Nayib Bukele, who is, of course, the president of El Salvador. Now, I'm not really an admirer of many politicians around the world at all, in fact. But Bukele has the remarkable ability to actually, and again, this shouldn't be very difficult, but to not only make a moral argument, but properly articulate the reasoning behind it, to explain to his liberal opposition exactly why what he's doing is morally just. Now, this is something that right-wing politicians in the West are particularly bad at, and we really need to start thinking of having this kind of ability to engage in proper philosophical discourse that is simply lacking. Now, I thought what we would do is just watch through this. Now, he's of course speaking in Spanish, so I'm just going to play it without the sound and speak verbalize the subtitles so we can discuss it. So he says the power of the state must be used not to violate human rights, but to guarantee human rights of those people whose rights are never defended. They say that all human rights carry the same weight. That's not true. The most important human right is the right to life. Now this, I think, is the most interesting part of this from the perspective of the right wing, is that the left have, of course, their intrinsic egalitarian tendencies. They want all things to be equal. However, on the right, we understand that humans are naturally hierarchical creatures, and therefore everything that humans do does have a hierarchy. And indeed, the considerations that we have towards rights is also a hierarchical system. And he is, of course, completely correct that the most important right that anyone ought to have is the right to life. As in, if we're going to use a kind of liberal framework of human rights, well, then these can't all be held in equality with one another, because some rights are in conflict with other rights. And of course, there are more important rights than others. The right to life being the only right that ultimately really matters above all of the others. The others are all subsidiary to it. And he points this out, without the right to life, there are no other rights. And so we have nothing else to talk about. If, say, a gang of people are given license to murder and kill and kidnap and do whatever they want to other people, then those people have the whole slew of human rights, the slate of human rights that the liberal wishes people to have. They have them all denied. And so anyone who is doing that, anyone who is responsible for doing that to those people, they are victimizers, they are criminals, they render themselves worthy of the summary judgment that the society wishes to put upon them. At the very minimum, they need to be incarcerated and prevented from hurting other people. That's the bare minimum. And then they can have jury trials, they can have whatever other associated legal rights that we wish to uphold applied. But first and foremost, the people causing the harm have to be prevented from causing the harm. Now, again, I realise that this might sound terribly remedial, but to the average liberal, this is actually not that straightforward, because, of course, they believe, as I've just mentioned, in an absolute equality of all things. And this means an equality of rights. So the right of freedom of movement for the gang murderer is as important as the right to life as his victims. And then, what do they have? Well, they have systems of power. That's how they calculate things. And so they say, well, the state has more power than the gang, which is correct, even though the gang is hardly a powerless entity. And so the state must be held accountable for the way it treats the gang. However, the gang is not being held accountable for the way that it treats its victims. And so this natural attempt, well, no, not natural, sorry, this artificial liberal attempt to create an equality of all things, as in to reduce the influence of the state to that of the gang. And I'm sure that afterwards they would try and reduce the influence of the gang, but it will not do anything other than create an environment in which gang members flourish and they are able to murder people at will, which is what had been happening in El Salvador. And this is what Bukele puts an end to. And he makes essentially this commentary later on, and then goes to point out that there's no one obviously the criminals themselves have human rights, but what he deliberately addresses is the rights that are in conflict with one another, and then points out, well, why is it the left are in defense of the criminals? Nobody speaks out about the rights of a woman whose nephew cut off her hands because she wouldn't pay extortion money. No, why aren't the left speaking out for her rights? Well, it's because, as far as they're concerned, the law-abiding, tax-paying citizen is actually more privileged than the criminal, even though the criminal has the power to intimidate, extort, and eventually mutilate this woman. The criminal, in their scheme of power analysis, power dynamics analysis, is in fact the victim of the taxpayer. The criminal is the victim of the state, and the state is supported by the taxpayer. And so if you follow the laws, if you pay your taxes, if you are a good and decent citizen, you are in fact in some way indirectly oppressing the criminal, who, by no fault of their own, by virtue of their own upbringing in the society that the law-abiding, tax-paying citizen upholds, has been rendered into a criminal. And so the criminal is the victim of the taxpayer. And so what about that woman's rights? Why don't they speak out? Well, on a systemic level, they view the woman as being the oppressor of the man who cut her hands off. That's why. And this is, of course, mad. This is, of course, a mad thing to interpret the situation between the nephew who cuts off his aunt's hands. It is mad to think of him as the victim. And yet, as Bukele points out, the left is speaking out in defense of him and not her. And this, I think, opens the proper revelation as to what the purpose of the right is. Right? The purpose of the right is, in fact, to begin to reconstruct out of the liberal morass of molten morals that we have found ourselves with a new way of looking at what right and wrong ought to be. And so we can quite easily see that from this, we can take the non-liberal, non-ideological view. Has this woman done something wrong? Has she personally, with her agency, conducted herself in a way that we could call immoral? The answer is, of course, no. Has the nephew gang member who cut her hands off done? Yes. So, of course, it's not very advanced moral calculus. But the point is, we need to begin anew, constructing what we think the just society ought to look like. And in fact, this is what Bukele himself is bringing about. He's beginning from the bottom and working his way upwards. And again, I realize that I'm going to be speaking to people who are mostly conservative or right-wing. And this won't sound like a dramatic revelation. But you've got to remember that Bukele is trying to persuade. He's trying to explain from within the framework of liberal rights that this has to be done, or else a state of affairs of perpetual injustice done from the excessive focus on liberal minoritarianism becomes a problem. I mean, I'm loath to invoke Ayn Rand, but she's not wrong that the smallest minority is the individual, right? I don't want to have to go down that road. I would rather think of it in more traditional terms and say, well, look at the individual person and the behavior that they engage in. Who is acting in a just and unjust way? And of course, the aunt who had her hands cut off is the one who is being dealt the injustice. And the purpose of the state ought to be to protect its own citizens from injustices. And he goes on to point out, well, what about the rights of the criminals? That's all the left is concerned about. But when viewed in the framework of a hierarchy of rights, with, of course, the right to life being the most important, suddenly it becomes very clear, even from the liberal perspective, that yes, okay, a right to life has to be protected. And if someone is a direct threat to others, even the most inveterate liberal, and only insane revolutionary communists could possibly be against imprisoning gang members because they're a threat to the right to life of others. And even then, surely they must be like, God, there must be something wrong with the way I think if I'm in defense of the guy murdering someone. Surely, like Keir Starmer. But even the most doctrinaire liberal will say, well, okay, I have to concede that there has to be a hierarchy of these rights. The gang member's freedom of action is not as important as the freedom of life, the right to life, that the law-abiding citizen has. It just can't be the case that these things are equals. And so one has to follow from another. Because, of course, if the gang member had no right to life, he would have no right to freedom of movement. So it is philosophically and logically proven in Bukele's speech that this is a hierarchical arrangement. And therefore, he is absolutely right to say, well, look, now we need to judge people on their behavior. We can't have, and again, the kind of barbarism that these gangs are engaged in. Like, if he had not taken the time to formulate a philosophical reason and moral argument to justify why the gangs should be locked up, and if he just relied on, look, they're barbarians and they're murdering people, we've got to lock them up, that would have been good enough, frankly. That would have been good enough. But the fact that he has, from within the liberal zone framework of human rights, decided to explain why these rights are hierarchical, because some of them are in conflict with others, and we need to be able to protect those primary rights, which is the right to life. I mean, another thing to point out is, I don't think it would have been unjustified if he had just had these gang members executed, right? If he just, we're not going to round them up, we're going to shoot them in a military operation because they are gangs literally of rapists and murderers, where to join the gang you have to rape or murder someone. It wouldn't have been unjustified to just have literally engage with them as if they're an enemy state and shoot them. But he didn't do that. He did, in fact, hold true to the philosophy he is laying out here. Says, no, it's our job to preserve rights. We are going to preserve their right to life, but also other people's right to life. And that means they have to sacrifice their freedom of movement because they are dangerous and they do not respect the right to life of others. I mean, that is a surprisingly fine needle to thread, frankly, and I think he's done it really, really effectively. And then to come out and explain his moral reasoning afterwards, again, no one was speaking up for the murder victims, only for the murderers. That's how demented the left is. But you have to be able to beat them on their own ground, right? You have to be able to beat them. And so what he's doing, and honestly, genuinely brilliantly, he is, from within the framework of the left, arguing for a hierarchy, which is, of course, what the right needs to do. And the purpose of the hierarchy, the ultimate moral justification of the hierarchy, is, as he says, for the human rights of the children who weren't able to actually live their lives as normal people. Like that is spectacular. That is a really, really effective, genuinely morally effective way of addressing the problem from within their own paradigm. This is a good way of persuading those in every group of people. You have those people who are utterly diehard and committed to it. Then you have those people who are kind of soft on the issue, but are sympathetic to it. And they're sort of like a larger concentric circle out. Then you have the people further outside of it who are kind of just, well, I'm not really sure. And then you have the people furthest away who are in opposition. And okay, the diehard core of people who will probably never care about the right to life of children or old people or just innocent civilians, well, they can't be persuaded, fine. But there's going to be a much larger concentric circle outside of those who are people who are won over by the myopic and narrow liberal argument as well. The state is just unjustly imprisoning these gang members. They haven't even had their trials. It's like, yeah, okay. And I'm sure that Bukele will give them trials. I'm sure that when you arrest 50,000 gang members or whatever it is, well, the administration of that probably takes some time, right? But the people who are soft on this and just hear the state is persecuting some of its own citizens, like, okay, it's not quite that simple. And the reason that Bukele is coming out and giving these arguments within the liberal framework is to get those people to understand that there is a much more complex issue that's happening in El Salvador. There is a much more complex issue that he is addressing, and sometimes that has to be done with vigor in order to protect the right to life of those who are least able to defend themselves from a much more powerful force, the gangs. Well, that necessitates a sacrifice of a subsidiary right. He hasn't taken away the right to life. I'm sure that if they are innocent, they will be found, they will be acquitted, they will be compensated. I doubt they are innocent. There is a process for this, I'm sure. But to protect some people's rights, those people have to understand that it is just a hierarchy of importance. That's what this is. And so this, again, I think is a really effective way of addressing the liberals' concerns in a way that actually, well, essentially undermines and diffuses their own position using their own logic. This is something the left has been doing to the liberals and the right for a long time now, and it's very impressive to see Bukele doing the same thing back to them in such a honestly quite a smooth way. He is very, very competently entered into their rhetoric and inserted this hierarchy of rights, which kind of explodes out the issue. And suddenly, yes, we have a world leader who is doing the right thing for children, women, old people, and innocent tax-paying, law-abiding citizens against insane, barbarous gangs. And he has, of course, solved the problem. The crime rate has absolutely plummeted in El Salvador. And he enjoys sort of like an 85% approval rating because he has saved these people from tyranny.